Hello friends, welcome back to another video on the channel. This is actually not a new video, it's the same video that was uploaded a week ago, but I have my voice at least somewhat back. So I will provide some commentary on this video, as a lot of people wanted me to. I'm sure there's a lot of people who do not want me to mess up a perfectly fine video with idiot comments, but yeah, that's kind of my thing, I suppose. We're looking at a really beat up old watch. You can see the case has been chrome plated, but that's largely degraded. Crystal is scratched and broken. The dial underneath seems very nice. And that beautiful emerald green gunk, which we will look a little bit more at, perfectly complements my workbench. The watch actually did start running when I wound it a little bit, so that's always a good sign. But exactly how well it runs, well, let's check it on the timegrapher. I think that's Morse code for please help. Let's dirty our tools a little bit and get that strap off. Let's just call the strap well used. And yeah, this is why I use tissue paper under these watches. And no, we're not going to reuse those spring bars. And as we take off the case back, we see an old friend, the AS 1130 movement, the so-called Wehrmachtswerk. Now, Wehrmacht means defense forces in German. And Werk, normally you would say Uhrwerk, which is watch movement in German. And it's commonly thought that the movement was named the Wehrmachtswerk because they were made for the German Wehrmacht during the war, so the Nazis. But that's not really the case. It's actually the other way around. The movement is big, almost 30 millimeters wide. And it's sturdy, simple, well built. So it became the movement of choice for military watches in Germany, for the Nazis, but also for other armed forces. And would you look at that dial? That is beautiful. So you will find this Wehrmachtswerk, the AS 1130, and actually a couple of other very similar designs, or identical pretty much, from other manufacturers also. But this is probably the most famous one. And yes, the Swiss watch industry certainly did make a lot of stuff for the Nazis. There's no hiding that. But that's then not actually where the Wehrmachtswerk name comes from. Anyway, let's take the dial off and store it safely together with the hands. So as you have seen, the brand name is Tanis. And yes, that is an anagram for my name, Stian. And it also was featured in Indiana Jones, but not quite the actual Tanis, which was a city in ancient Egypt. But the brand Tanis does not exist anymore, for watches that is. You will find a few Tanis watches if you search online, but the brand died during the quartz crisis. But they did make some relatively high-end watches. You can see that this one has a lot of jewels. 20 rubies, it says, both on the movement and on the dial. Can see this movement hasn't really seen a lot of love for, I don't know how many decades, but Certainly decades rather than years. Also see that the case screw, the one that was there, was broken, so we're gonna have to replace that as well.
No, it's me.
All in all, a very simple movement, of course. Three-hand movement, as you call it, with no complications whatsoever. Just keeping time. And as we saw on the time grapher, it doesn't really do that even, so... Anyway, let's first pre-clean it a little bit before we put it in the cleaning machine. That's to get most of the hardened gunk off, and also to save the liquid a little bit in the cleaning machine. You see the mainspring is of the modern kind, so the watch has been serviced probably later than the 60s. But given that it does not have an Inca block shock protection, it's probably from the 40s, I would guess. Here I'm cleaning the pivots with this rubber stick called the Eve Flex. That's just to get the hard gunk off the pivots, it's not polishing them. And we can see it's a relatively low number of parts, but they need a lot of cleaning. So let's put our machine to work. So while the machine is cleaning the movement, let's have a look at the case. We're going to change the crystal also, so we'll just press that out. And gunk fetishists, this is your time to shine, huh? Go, baby, go! That's enough gunk to start a new vegetable garden, I think. Decades of wrist cheese and... Well, I don't really want to speculate what those things might be, but let's get rid of it. And before starting work on the case and the bezel, we're gonna clean it in the ultrasonic. Now when working on watch cases and the bezel back and so forth, there are basically two types of surfaces. One is flat surfaces and the other is curved surfaces. For flat surfaces, we want to keep them flat. And we do that by using a lapping machine, which is basically just a disc rotating, as you see here. But it needs to rotate very true so that you don't get, let's say, uneven finishing. Now the challenge is that most watchmakers don't have lapping machines, and they very often have mopping wheels or felt wheels, and if you put a flat surface on those kinds of wheels, you will round the flat surfaces. So that's a bit of a, let's say, value-based question. How far are you going to go in either restoring the original shape or staying true to the shape that has emerged? So for this watch, I don't think it's ever been polished because of the case having degraded like it is. So yeah, we are going to take the chrome plating off and then basically try to stay as true to the original shape as possible. So for the case back, you saw that I lapped the rim, but the center part was brushed, and we're going to restore that. There is an engraving, however, and we never want to remove that engraving, so we're going to have to reach a trade-off between a nice finish and keeping the engraving. Alright, that looks better. So let's get back to the movement. The balance is wobbling like a drunken penguin running from a polar bear. And yes, I know that polar bears and penguins live on the opposite sides of the planet, but just imagine that penguin going, and then you have the polar bear going behind it. That frantic, panicked wobble is kind of what I pictured when I saw this balance, but then again, as my wife has unprompted volunteered on several occasions, I am an idiot. Yeah. So looking a little bit closer at this, we can see that the pivot is bent. Rather, the pivot is bent. And there's really only one way to fix that, and that is to replace the balance staff. So we're first going to take the hairspring off. For that, we gently use a pair of small levers. And for taking the staff out of the balance, you know, there's this saying that there's an app for that. For watchmaking, the saying is there's a tool for that. And this is a tool called the Playtax tool. It's not made anymore, and simply for the reason that it's not a very big task for watchmakers anymore. But for vintage watches, you might have to replace the balance staff sometimes. And after a few tippy taps, 1.5-year-old toddler would be embarrassed by, we do get the balance staff out. Now the balance itself basically has 3 parts. You have the roller on the left, you have the balance staff in the middle, and then you have the balance wheel. And all of these are small. So we can still get new replacement balance staffs for a movement like this. The AS1130 was produced in millions and millions, and all up until the 1980s, I believe. So with a new balance staff, we find the right-sized hole. Then we use a set of punches. What we do first is to use a domed punch that basically expands a little bit of the steel in the balance staff so that you rivet it to the balance wheel. And then afterwards we use a flat punch, flat stake, to make sure that the balance wheel is true flat on the staff. And then we turn it upside down, and then we press the roller on. Now, as some pointed out in a comment, this is not safe, as I'm showing here. You need to have support underneath the spoke, which I did, but I didn't get that on video, so I decided to just show this initial attempt. And then finally we can put the hairspring back on. And with the balance ready, we can then oil the capstone. So this has the old style capstone before shock protections were common. So the Inca block was actually invented in 1933, but it wasn't mainstream until the mid-1940s. And before that, you have to disassemble the balance cock, which is a little bit extra work, but that's how it is. We're using a fixer drop here to create a little film on the surface where we're gonna oil or lubricate the pallet. So that's on the tip of the pallet stones and also then on the escape wheel. Then we're cleaning the pivots on these two in some pith wood. So I'm going to put a little tiny drop of oil in the center of the capstone. Could also oil through the opening there, but you should at least disassemble the cock anyway, just to clean it properly. All right. And then we can continue assembling the rest of the movement. Now the movement itself is of course very straightforward. It's a very basic movement in terms of complexity. But that's also why it was so popular, because it is not at all complex. It's very solid, very sturdy, and it gives good performance. So the mainspring I wasn't actually able to fit onto any of my mainspring winders. So I had to do that by hand. It's not complicated to do it by hand, but it is a bit more risky. So I prefer not to do it if I don't have to. But I do know that there are some viewers who would like to see a video where I actually do that. So I'll do that at some point in the future. Now, one thing that is pretty common on these old watches is that the bearing for the barrel arbor is worn. And that's when you see this play here. You see the barrel just wobbles a bit too much. This is commonly in the bridge hole because that's made of thinner metal. So we're going to hammer this one like a drunken blacksmith whose wife has just cheated on him with a watch salesman. And we're using a domed stake and also a domed anvil. And together they then compress the hole so much that the hole actually becomes a little bit too small. And then we open it up a little bit again with a smoothing broach. So that way we can control the hole size, but then also compress the metal a little bit around the hole so that you get a stronger bearing. And I didn't mean to whisper, it's just that I'm having a bit of a cold still. Well, of course I did mean to whisper that part, but not the first one, you know. Okay. So we see that there is some tarnish to quite a lot of these plates and bridges, and that's simply age. The movement is copper plated, and over time it hasn't been cleaned often enough. So this grime has been eating into the plating, and that's what you see. It's very shallow. It has no functional impact. But it doesn't look great, obviously. So putting the rest of the watch together is relatively straightforward. So while I do that on the video, I thought I would make a few comments around timing. So there's been some questions every now and then about how they used to time things in the old days. So before you had timegraphers. Now, timegraphers were first invented, I believe, in the 1950s, at least commercially. I'm not sure when they were, let's say, widespread, but I would guess by the 1990s or something like that. Not too much earlier, at least, but if there's anyone who knows or worked, let's say, in the 1960s or 70s as a watchmaker, it would be very interesting to learn in the comments if you had timegraphers back then. But of course, the need to have accurate timekeeping is something that's quite new, actually. When I was born, and sort of my generation from the late 60s, you would talk about time to the nearest 5 minutes. And I still do that. Someone asks me what time it is, I would probably still say, let's say, 10 to 4. If the watch actually says 15:48. But the younger generation is, of course, used to digital timekeeping, where you would say time to the nearest minute. But it's still very rare that you need to know the time to the nearest second. So honestly, I think today we're at an accuracy level where you probably would want to know the time to the nearest minute. Because you need to be in, let's say, a Zoom call or things like that, where you want to be a bit more precise than to the 5 minutes. And who knows, maybe in a couple of generations you will want to be precise to the second. That might be. But anyway, what you would do back in the old days before you had a device, either a dedicated timegrapher or an app even on the phone, you would need to have, let's say, a reference. Typically that would be a regulator clock. That's a very precise clock that you trusted. And then you would just have to set your watch and keep it for a day or so. And then see how many seconds it was off. Of course, initially you could adjust it after just a few hours if you saw that it was many seconds off already. But then as you get a little bit closer to just a few seconds off per day, you would have to take longer intervals to see how accurate your watch was. Another thing with timegraphers, as we have them today, is that they only show you a snapshot. They only show you what time the watch is keeping in that position at that specific point in time. So if you change the position, the timekeeping will change a little bit. If you wait a little bit, the timekeeping will change a little bit because the mainspring will wind down or up if it's automatic even. If there's a problem with one of the wheels, it might not show right then, but it could show later. So a timegrapher is a much overrated thing. Anyway, since we have one, let's see how the watch runs after we fix the balance staff. It's actually running pretty well. We see straight lines. That is what we want to see. We do have to fix the beat error though, so we do that the old-fashioned way. And for the eagle-eyed, yes, that was footage stolen from a different watch. That is how you adjust the beat error in these old watches. So we see the balance rotates nicely without the wobble. So the penguins are safe. And at this point in time, the watch keeps a very nice time. But as noted, that does change a little bit over time as the mainspring winds down. Changes a little bit with the position the watch is kept in and so forth. As a watchmaker, of course, you need to make sure that the watch runs well in at least 3 positions. That's dial up, dial down, and 9 up, which is how the watch would be worn if your hand hangs straight down. All right. With the movement nearly ready, we can turn to the dial. We just need to clean it a little bit. And this watch even had some gunk at the back of the dial, which is normally not a concern, but for this one it was. And it's such a beautiful dial. Very nice. Not too much to do, just clean it off a little bit with some lukewarm water. We're going to wipe off the hands a little bit as well. And then we can put the dial back on. The dial is typically held in place by a couple of tiny screws. And the hands are then friction fit onto the wheels. So that the hour hand is a very tight fit on the tube of the hour wheel. And the same thing with the rest of the hands. So the hour hand we don't have to align to anything, but as you might remember, when the long hand points straight up, then the short hand should point to one of the numbers. Or in other words, we need to align the minute hand with the full hour. Also need to make sure that the hands are parallel to the dial so that they don't rub against the dial or one another. And that looks good. The crystal, we're going to replace it. It's a standard crystal, so we just use our crystal press for that. We have this little anvil, if you will, that we basically just press the crystal against. That will curve the edge of the crystal a little bit downwards. And we can then fit the bezel so that the edge fits into that little cutout, I suppose, in the bezel. Just like that. Shiny. So the case is made of nickel. It's a pretty common material for watch cases in the old days mostly. The thing with nickel is that when it's polished it has this beautiful yellow or golden tinge. We can see here it kind of looks like, let's say, a 14 karat or 9 karat gold watch. The downside is that it does oxidize pretty fast, so it doesn't stay that nice and shiny for too long. But I decided to leave it as is because it just looks so good as it is. One thing we have to do, or actually two things. One is that the case screws were gone. And clamps are too big, so we're going to have to file them down. And also actually have to pretty much make screws that fit. And the other thing is that the stem was too long. It was also rusted, so I had to clean it up a little bit. And then the crown as well was very worn, so I will have to find another crown. Ooh, right up there with the ultrasonic. Good old nail scratching against the blackboard vibes. All right, let's get the case back on. And the bezel with the crystal. And then the watch is ready to wear. Before seeing the watch on the wrist, I just want to remind everyone that if you go to vintagewatchservices.eu, you will always find more than 100 beautiful vintage watches. And as a YouTube subscriber, you get a 10% discount. And there we have it. A Tanis 1940s watch with the AS 1130 Wehrmachtswerk inside. Beautiful old watch. I hope you liked this video. If you did, then clicking like and subscribe will really help the channel. So please consider doing that. We'll be back with another video shortly. Until then, ta-ta.